Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. Not long ago, I went on a quest. I went searching for 25 purportedly true ghost stories, all of them published in a variety of Victorian books and magazines. I actually tried to avoid the usual sources, something like Catherine Crowe's The Night Side of Nature, published in 1848. It's a fairly famous collection of paranormal occurrences. I avoided those because, as far as I know, they're too easy to find. The Night Side of Nature, for instance, I believe has never been out of print, or if it has, it hasn't been out of print for very long. It's still available in new editions today. I'm happy to say that I accomplished my goal. I have the true ghost stories. They come from all different kinds of sources, and they're probably stories that haven't been read or heard in well over a century, which I think that's kind of cool. This season on Tales Told When the Windows Rattle, I'll be sharing those 25 allegedly true ghost stories published during the Victorian period. In this episode, I will look at stories of people who have gone traveling. They are visitors, and they stayed in a curious room for a while. There they had a ghostly encounter. Now, usually what happens is the next day they tell the host, here's what happened, and they are informed of, oh, you should have never gone into that room because here's some violent or very tragic history linked to it. I have two stories that follow that basic template, but then one story that really doesn't. Let me start with a pretty short tale. I found it in a magazine called Lucifer, published in 1892. There's no author mentioned, but they say that the text comes from a magazine titled Woman, and I haven't been able to find that original source. My friend, like myself, is not a believer in the supernatural, nor should I describe him as an imaginative or visionary person. He was staying a short time ago in a country house in Ireland with a friend who had but lately taken unto himself a second wife. The first evening passed pleasantly, and my friend retired to rest in the best of spirits. He was, some time after going to bed, awakened by the opening of his door and the sudden appearance of a shaft of light coming through it, showing him the figure of a woman in evident distress. He spoke to her, and on receiving no answer, seized the box of matches and endeavored to light a candle. When at last he succeeded in doing so, the light and the woman were gone, and the door was closed. Unable to sleep after this mysterious apparition, my friend, for 2 hours, tried to convince himself that he had been the victim of a ghostly dream, and while endeavoring to take this view of the case, was horrified to see the door slowly and noiselessly opened, and the same woman enter his room. This time he saw her face and recognized it as the original of a portrait opposite to which he sat during dinner. The tears poured down her cheeks as she went to the window and looked, and then outside he heard a child crying. But again, as he spoke and endeavored to spring from his bed, the vision vanished, and my friend, who is certainly no coward, admits that he was paralyzed by fear of the uncanny proceedings. At breakfast, he told his host of his night's adventures and heard from him the explanation of the phenomenon. The lady whose portrait he saw on the wall had been his first wife and had died of grief caused by the loss of their only child, who had been killed by a fall from a window of the very room in which my friend had slept. Until too ill to leave her bed, the bereaved mother had persistently visited. Indeed, she began to haunt the room which had been the scene of so sad an accident. Since her death, these appearances and sounds had, it was alleged by several people, been seen and heard continually. It was only through the ignorance of a servant new to the place that the mistake had been made of putting my friend there, for the room, left as it was at her death, was now never used. This next story comes from one of the most interesting sources that I found, at least in terms of finding a ghost story in it. The title is Recollections of Society in France and England. It was published in 1872 and written by Lady Clementina Davies. Basically, it's an autobiographical account of Davies' travels through France and England, traveling in very posh circles, attending balls, and hobnobbing with the hoi polloi. I was not expecting to find a ghost story in it, but surely enough, she does relate her own ghostly encounter, and it follows the same basic pattern, the same steps as the last story. After the season was over, my brother and his wife went to Germany, and I accompanied my husband on a visit to his mother. With her, we remained a month, and after that we proceeded to Monmouthshire to pay a visit to my brother-in-law and his wife. My brother-in-law, the vicar of Chepstow, was residing at that place, and we determined to drive thither in an open carriage, calling for him on our way to Penmoil, a lovely place belonging to his wife's mother, where he had been making a short stay. A grand ball was to be given at Chepstow on our arrival, but it was with difficulty that we reached there in time for it, as an accident happened to our carriage when we were at some distance from Penmoil, and we were compelled to conclude the remainder of our journey in a stagecoach. We reached Chepstow just in time to dress for the ball. A confirmation was to take place the following Sunday, and the Bishop of Llandaff was staying with my brother-in-law, as also were other clerical friends who had to take part in the ceremony. As they filled the vicarage and prevented the vicar from giving us our usual rooms, it was arranged that we should stay at a neighboring house. From the ball we did not return until daylight. Our bedroom stood at the farther end of a long passage. The next night, near 12 o'clock, we were awakened by the creaking sound of heavy boots, worn, as it seemed, by somebody walking up and down this passage. The noise continued so long that at last Mr. Davies opened the door to look out and see who it was that made it. For a moment, the footsteps ceased. Nobody was to be seen. Mr. Davies asked angrily who was it that had made so much disturbance, but he received no answer. The passage was quite empty. My husband therefore closed the door, but no sooner had he done so than the marching up and down began again, and was all the more intolerable because every time the steps passed our door they seemed to pause for a moment in their heavy creaking tread. Mr. Davies was determined to find out the cause of this annoyance and to stop it. When the next time the tramp of the heavy boots approached nearer and nearer to us, he flung open the door suddenly and darted out into the passage, a lighted candle in his hand. But nothing was to be seen. No human being was there. The passage was still quite empty. There were several candles in our room. Mr. Davies now lighted every one of them and set the door wide open so that a flood of light should rest on the passage and reveal the intruder if he approached again. He watched, but all to no purpose. The tramp, tramp, tramp continued. The heavy footsteps passed and repassed the open door, yet nothing was visible. Whether it was from fright or not, I cannot say, but to me the room seemed so much colder than could be accounted for by the mere fact of the open door that I shuddered terribly. I cannot describe the horrible sensation which ran through me at this unaccountable noise, which continued steadily without cessation all through the night until daylight came, and then it ceased. When my maid came to me at a late hour in the morning, I told her of the fact. She made inquiries concerning it, but as everyone declared that there was nobody in the house who could possibly be suspected of producing such a disturbance, my maid supposed that I must have been dreaming. But when, in the course of the morning, we went to take breakfast at the vicarage, and there mentioned the noise by which we had been disturbed until daylight, my brother-in-law confessed that many persons had told him of having been annoyed in exactly the same manner when occupying the room in which we had been placed. Until now he had tried to disbelieve them. There was a tradition, he added, appertaining to that house, to the effect that a great sportsman, a Mr. Dennison, who always wore thick, creaking boots, had been robbed and murdered in the room we had occupied. To pass another such night was impossible, and we at once changed our quarters. Several years afterwards, I happened to mention the circumstance to the late Lady Glenworth, who, at a period subsequent to our visit to Chepstow, had taken the house in which we had spent that horrible night. She told me that she and her family had been compelled to quit it on account of the same mysterious disturbance. The murderer of Mr. Dennison, the sportsman who wore the heavy boots, was never discovered, and the house in which the dreadful deed was committed has since been pulled down. Now, interestingly, Lady Davies follows her own ghostly encounter with one that she heard from somebody else. It takes place in Scotland, and it's basically an old-fashioned version of the vanishing hitchhiker urban legend. You know, somebody picks up a hitchhiker, she has to be dropped off at the graveyard, and the driver later finds out that she's been dead all along. In the story shared by Lady Davies, there's a man who returns to Edinburgh, and on the street he sees the butler of his father. They have a little chit-chat. The guy turns the corner, and suddenly the butler is gone. He finds out afterwards that the butler has been dead for several weeks. It's really interesting to look at some of these old ghost stories and to see how on a very basic level we're still telling those ghost stories. But here's a ghost story of a visitor, goes to a room, has a ghostly encounter, but this one has a very, very different feel to it, and let me go ahead and read it to you. It's written by Augustus Jessup. He titled it, or somebody titled it, An Antiquary's Ghost Story, and it appeared in an 1880 issue of The Athenaeum. On the 10th of October, 1879, I drove over from Norwich to Mannington Hall to spend the night at Lord Orford's. Though I was in perfect health and high spirits, it is fair to state that for some weeks previously I had had a great deal to think about, some little anxiety, and some considerable mental strain of one kind or another. I was not, however, conscious of anything approaching weariness, irritability, or fatigue. I arrived at 4 p.m. and was engaged in pleasant and animated conversation till it was time to dress for dinner. We dined at 7. Our party numbered 6 persons. Of these, 4 at least had been great travellers. I myself was rather a listener. The talk was general and discursive, and amused and interested me greatly. Not for a single moment did it turn upon the supernatural. It was chiefly concerned with questions of art and the experiences of men who had seen a great deal of the world, and could describe intelligently what they had seen and comment upon it suggestively. I have very rarely been at a more pleasant party. After dinner, we played a rubber. We left off as we began, and as 2 of the guests had some distance to drive, we broke up at 10:30. The main object of my going over to Mannington was to examine and take notes upon some very rare books in Lord Orford's library. I had been anxiously wishing to get a sight of these for some years, but had never been fortunate enough to meet with up to this time. I asked leave to sit up for some hours and make transcripts. His lordship at first wished me to let his valet remain in attendance to see all lights put out, but as this would have embarrassed me and compelled me to go to bed earlier than I wished, and as it seemed likely that I should be occupied till 2 or 3 in the morning, it was agreed that I should be left to my own devices, and the servants should be allowed to retire. By 11 o'clock, I was the only person downstairs, and I was very soon busily at work and absorbed in my occupation. The room in which I was writing is a large one, with a huge fireplace and a grand old chimney. It is needless to say that it is furnished with every comfort and luxury. The library opens into this room, and I had to pass out from where I was sitting into this library to get upon a chair to reach the volumes I wanted to examine. There were 6 small volumes in all. I took them down and placed them at my right hand in a little pile, and set to work, sometimes reading, sometimes writing. As I finished with the book, I placed it in front of me. There were 4 silver candlesticks upon the table, the candles all burning, and as I am a chilly person, I sat myself at one corner of the table with the fire at my left. At intervals, as I had finished with a book, I rose, knocked the fire together, and stood up to warm my feet. I continued in this way at my task till nearly 1 o'clock. I had got on better than I expected, and had only one more book to occupy me. I rose, wound my watch, and opened a bottle of seltzer water, and I remember thinking to myself that I should get to bed by 2 after all. I set to work at the last little book. I had been engaged upon it about half an hour, and was just beginning to think that my work was drawing to a close, when, as I was actually writing, I saw a large white hand within a foot of my elbow. Turning my head, there sat a figure of a somewhat large man, with his back to the fire, bending slightly over the table, and apparently examining the pile of books that I had been working upon. The man's face was turned away from me, but I saw his closely cut reddish-brown hair, his ear and shaved cheek, the eyebrow, the corner of the right eye, the side of the forehead, and the large high cheekbone. He was dressed in what I can only describe as a kind of ecclesiastical habit of thick-corded silk or some such material, closed up to the throat, and a narrow rim or edging about an inch broad of satin or velvet, serving as a stand-up collar and fitting close to the chin. The right hand, which had first attracted my attention, was clasping, without any great pressure, the left hand. Both hands were in perfect repose, and the large blue veins of the right hand were conspicuous. I remember thinking the hand was like the hand of Velasquez's magnificent Dead Knight in the National Gallery. I looked at my visitor for some seconds, and was perfectly sure that he was not a reality. 1,000 thoughts came crowding upon me, but not the least feeling of alarm or even uneasiness. Curiosity and a strong interest were uppermost. For an instant I felt eager to make a sketch of my friend, and I looked at a tray on my right for a pencil. Then I thought, upstairs I have a sketchbook. Shall I fetch it? There he sat, and I was fascinated, afraid not of his staying, but lest he should go. Stopping in my writing, I lifted my left hand from the paper, stretched it out to the pile of books, and moved the top one. I cannot explain why I did this, but as my arm passed in front of the figure, it vanished. I was simply disappointed, and nothing more. I went on with my writing as if nothing had happened, perhaps for another 5 minutes, and I had actually got to the last few words of what I had determined to extract when the figure appeared again, exactly in the same place and attitude as before. I saw the hands close to my own. I turned my head again to examine him more closely, and I was framing a sentence to address to him when I discovered that I dare not to speak. I was afraid of the sound of my own voice. There he sat, and there sat I. I turned my head again to my work and finished writing the 2 or 3 words I still had to write. The paper and my notes are, at this moment, before me, and exhibit not the slightest tremor or nervousness. I could point out the words I was writing when the phantom came and when he disappeared. Having finished my task, I shut the book and threw it on the table. It made a slight noise as it fell. The figure vanished. Throwing myself back in my chair, I sat for some seconds looking at the fire with a curious mixture of feeling, and I remember wondering whether my friend would come again, and if he did, whether he would hide the fire from me. Then first there stole upon me a dread and a suspicion that I was beginning to lose my nerve. I remember yawning. Then I rose, lit my bedroom candle, took my books into the inner library, mounted the chair as before, and replaced 5 of the volumes. The 6th I brought back and laid upon the table where I had been writing when the phantom did me the honor to appear to me. By this time I had lost all sense of uneasiness. I blew out the 4 candles and marched off to bed, where I slept the sleep of the just, or the guilty, I know not which, but I slept very soundly. This is a simple and unvarnished narrative of facts. Explanation, theory, or inference, I leave to others. Signed, Augustus Jessup, Doctor of Divinity. Where do we begin with this story? Well, first of all, the narrator, by his own admission, had been feeling anxious and was seemingly tired, but not to the point of hallucination, right? And yet, that's self-diagnosis. And how many times have you heard somebody say, "Oh, I'm fine," and they were not fine? So self-diagnosis is not a terribly reliable thing. But what I find really interesting about this story is the ghost. As far as we know, there's no children falling out of windows. There's no booted hunter being murdered. No tragic background here that we know about, but it just seems to be a ghost who's curious about what this stranger is doing. What are you up to? What are these books? I volunteer at the local community theater, and there's a lot of weird, ghostly stuff that happens out there. People hear their names said, turn to look, and there's nobody there. That happened to me once. A lot of corner of the eye, peripheral vision kind of stuff. I was in the tech booth once. Somebody came walking up the stairs. I turned to look, and there was nobody there. This ghost feels kind of like the ghosts that are haunting our community theater. They're not exceptionally tragic. They're not out to get us. They don't evoke fear in me. But there are some. We do have some members who get pretty startled by them, understandably. As I mentioned, this season on Tales Told When the Windows Rattle, I will be looking at those 25 Victorian ghost stories. I hope you come back and take a listen to more of them. If you would like to learn more about these stories, perhaps download them to read yourself, or just learn the bibliographical information so that you can read the originals, there's a website you can visit at ghostlyharside.wordpress.com. There you'll also learn about the long, long tradition of telling ghost stories by a fire, often during winter, sometimes during Christmas. Sometimes you just need a stormy night, or maybe not even that. Once again, the website is ghostlyharside, all one word, .wordpress, all one word, .com. I'm Tim Prossel, and thank you very much for listening.